The weight of silence. The air in the transport van was thick with the scent of metal and stale coffee. Elena Marquez sat shackled to the bench, her wrists bound by cold steel cuffs that bit into her skin with every jolt of the vehicle. Outside, the Florida sun blazed, its heat seeping through the van's tinted windows, but inside, the air conditioning hummed a sterile chill. Elena's dark hair clung to her forehead, damp with sweat, as she stared at the floor, counting the scuff marks to keep her mind from spiraling. She was no stranger to confinement. For 3 years, she'd been inmate number 47219 at FCI Tallahassee, a low-security federal prison where the days bled into one another, each marked by the same gray walls and the same whispered rumors. But today was different. Today, she was being transferred, uprooted from the humid, mosquito-ridden sprawl of northern Florida to a minimum security camp in Bryan, Texas. The federal prison camp, they called it. A camp, as if it were a summer retreat and not a place to serve out the remaining 17 years of her sentence. Elena wasn't naive. She knew why she was being moved. The whispers had started a week ago, after her meeting with a Justice Department official, a man in a crisp suit who'd sat across from her in a sterile room at the Tallahassee courthouse. His name was Daniel Whitaker, and his questions had been sharp, probing, digging into memories she'd spent years burying. He'd spoken of rehabilitation, of a chance to make things right, but his eyes had carried a different message: we need something from you. And then, just like that, her public safety factor, the designation that kept sex offenders like her in higher security facilities, had been waived. A bureaucratic sleight of hand, and now she was on her way to a place with no fences, dorm-style housing, and fewer guards. A place where she could breathe a little easier, but at what cost? The van hit a pothole, and Elena's head jerked up. Across from her, another inmate, a woman named Carla, muttered a curse under her breath. "You believe this?" Carla said, her voice low, conspiratorial. "They're sending us to a damn country club while the world outside screams about it. You see the news?" Elena didn't respond. She'd learned early on to keep her mouth shut. The news, filtered through the prison's grainy television screens, had been relentless: convicted sex trafficker moved to luxury prison camp. Victims outraged at preferential treatment. The headlines stung, but they weren't wrong. Elena had been part of a machine, a network that preyed on the vulnerable, luring young girls with promises of wealth and glamour, only to deliver them into the hands of monsters. She'd been the charming face, the one who made the girls feel safe, special, chosen. And now, she was the one being offered a softer landing. "You don't talk much, do you?" Carla pressed, her eyes narrowing. "What did you tell that suit to get this deal?" Elena's jaw tightened. "I didn't tell him anything," she lied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. She hadn't told Whitaker everything, not yet, but she'd given him enough. Names, dates, places. Fragments of a past she'd tried to erase. In return, he'd promised her a chance at redemption, a way to help the victims. But Elena knew better than to trust promises. She'd made too many of them herself. The van slowed, and the driver's voice crackled through the partition. "FPC Bryan, 10 minutes out." Elena's heart quickened. She didn't know what awaited her in Texas, but she knew one thing: the past was never far behind. The camp. Federal Prison Camp Bryan was nothing like Tallahassee. Where Tallahassee had been a fortress of concrete and razor wire, Bryan was open, almost pastoral. The facility sat on a flat expanse of land, surrounded by fields that stretched toward the horizon. The buildings were low-slung, with red-tiled roofs and windows that let in too much light. There were no fences, just a perimeter marked by signs warning inmates not to cross. It felt like a cruel joke, a prison that dared you to run, knowing you wouldn't get far. Elena was assigned to a dormitory with 50 other women, their beds lined up like soldiers in a barracks. Her bunkmate, a wiry woman named Marisol, greeted her with a nod and a warning: don't expect much privacy, and don't trust anyone who's too friendly. Marisol was serving 5 years for tax fraud, a crime that seemed almost quaint compared to Elena's. But Marisol didn't ask questions, and for that, Elena was grateful. The first week was a blur of orientation sessions and work assignments. Elena was put on groundskeeping duty, raking leaves and trimming hedges under the watchful eye of a guard who seemed more interested in his phone than in her. The work was mindless, but it gave her time to think, too much time. Her mind kept circling back to the meeting with Whitaker, to the questions he'd asked about the girls, the parties, the men who'd paid for access. She'd given him just enough to keep him interested, but not enough to implicate herself further. It was a dangerous game, one she'd played before, but never with stakes this high. At night, lying on her thin mattress, Elena listened to the sounds of the dorm, the soft snores, the occasional sob, the rustle of pages as someone read by flashlight. She thought of the girls she'd recruited, their faces blurring together in her memory. There was Lily, barely 15, with dreams of becoming a model. There was Sarah, who'd trusted Elena because she'd reminded her of an older sister. And there was Mia, who'd fought back, who'd looked at Elena with such raw hatred that it still burned in her chest. She wondered where they were now, if they'd found a way to heal, or if they carried the same weight she did. The weight of silence, of complicity, of choices that could never be undone. The letter. One morning, during mail call, Elena received a letter. It was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, with no return address. The handwriting was precise, almost clinical, and the words hit her like a punch to the gut. "We know what you did. We know you're trying to rewrite your story. You don't get to walk away from this." The letter wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Elena knew who it was from, or at least, who it represented. The victims. The families. The ones who'd stood outside the courthouse during her trial, holding signs and shouting for justice. She'd seen their faces on the news, heard their voices in the courtroom as they read their impact statements. "You opened the door to hell," one had said. "You damaged me physically, mentally, sexually, emotionally." The words echoed in her mind, as sharp now as they'd been then. She tucked the letter into her pocket, her hands trembling. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the letter was a warning or a promise. The next day, she volunteered for extra work, hoping to exhaust herself into oblivion, but the words followed her, clinging like damp air. She started noticing things, a glance from another inmate that lingered too long, a guard who seemed to watch her more closely than the others. Paranoia, maybe, but Elena had learned to trust her instincts. Someone was watching her, waiting for her to slip. The visitor. 2 weeks after her arrival at Bryan, Elena was called to the visitation room. She assumed it was Whitaker again, come to press her for more information, but instead, she found a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was in her late 30s, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous energy that made her fingers tap against the table. Her name was Rachel, and she introduced herself as a journalist working on a book about the victims of Elena's crimes. "I'm not here to judge you," Rachel said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm here to understand. To give the girls a voice." Elena's first instinct was to shut down, to say nothing, but something in Rachel's eyes stopped her. There was no pity there, no accusation, just a quiet determination. Rachel pulled out a notebook and began asking questions, not about the crimes, but about Elena's life before. Her childhood in a crumbling mansion on the outskirts of London, her father's media empire, the way it all fell apart after his death. The questions were gentle, almost conversational, but they cut deep. Elena found herself talking, hesitantly at first, then with a rush of words she hadn't known she was holding back. She told Rachel about the loneliness, the pressure to be perfect, the way she'd fallen into Jeffrey's orbit because he'd promised her a world where she could belong. She didn't talk about the girls, not yet, but she talked about herself, about the choices that had led her here. Rachel listened, her pen moving across the page, and for the first time in years, Elena felt seen, not as a monster, but as a person who'd made monstrous choices. When the visit ended, Rachel slid a card across the table. "If you're ready to tell the whole story, call me," she said. "Not for you. For them." Elena kept the card but didn't call. Not yet. The reckoning. The letter wasn't the last. More came, each one sharper than the last, each one reminding her that the world hadn't forgotten. One included a photograph of a girl Elena recognized, Lily, now a woman, standing in front of a community center with a sign that read "Survivors Speak." The back of the photo had a single word, "Remember." Elena's meetings with Whitaker continued, and the pressure mounted. He wanted more, specifics, evidence, names of powerful men who'd been at the parties. Elena knew what he was after, a scandal big enough to shift the narrative, to make her transfer look like a strategic move rather than a favor. But every time she opened her mouth, she saw Lily's face, Sarah's, Mia's. She saw the letter writer's words, "You don't get to walk away." One night, unable to sleep, Elena slipped out of her bunk and sat at a table in the common area, the letter and the photo in front of her. Marisol found her there, her eyes softening as she took in the scene. "You can't carry it all," Marisol said quietly. "You gotta let some of it go." "I don't know how," Elena admitted, her voice breaking. Marisol sat across from her, silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Start with the truth. Not for them. For you." The next day, Elena called Rachel. She didn't know if she was ready to tell the whole story, but she was ready to start. Over the next few weeks, she met with Rachel regularly, piecing together the fragments of her past. She talked about the girls, the guilt, the moments when she'd wanted to stop but didn't. Rachel recorded it all, her face unreadable, but her questions were always kind, always focused on the victims. The redemption. Elena's story began to take shape, not as a defense, but as a confession. She wrote letters to the victims, not expecting forgiveness, but offering accountability. She gave Whitaker what he wanted, names, dates, details, but she did it on her terms, knowing it might not change her sentence or her fate. The letters from the outside slowed, then stopped. The photograph of Lily stayed with her, a reminder of the work she still had to do. In the dorm, Elena started a group for inmates who wanted to talk about their pasts, their regrets, their hopes for redemption. It wasn't much, just a circle of women sitting on folding chairs, sharing stories in hushed voices, but it was a start. Marisol joined, then others, and soon the group was a fixture, a small beacon of hope in a place designed to extinguish it. Elena never forgot the weight of her crimes, but she learned to carry it differently. She learned to speak, to listen, to face the truth. And in the open fields of Bryan, under a sky that felt too big for her guilt, she began to believe that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building something new from its ashes. Epilogue. Years later, Rachel's book was published. It was called The Weight of Silence, and it told the stories of the girls, the survivors, the ones who'd fought to reclaim their lives. Elena's chapters were there too, raw and unflinching, a testament to her role in their pain and her attempt to make amends. The book didn't erase her crimes, but it gave the victims a voice, a space to be heard. And for Elena, it was a step toward living with the weight she'd carried for so long. In Bryan, she continued her work, one day at a time, knowing she'd never fully escape the shadow of her past. But she was no longer silent. And that, she realized, was the first step toward freedom.